to see what God teaches us about what to expect. Look at the book of Revelation. See, when God says, the old order of things has passed away. We live in the old order of things, contaminated by sin. What is God going to be doing? The new order of things has no more death or mourning or crying or pain in it. It only has God in it. It only has life in it. So what is like? I don't know. Read the book of Revelation. Look at Revelation 21. Okay? But there's one verse I really want you to look at, and that's, I think it's on the third page. The bottom of the third page. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. It says, brothers, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. I love that passage because how does God view death? It's just falling asleep. You fall asleep in this world, you wake up in heaven. He doesn't call it something terrible, rotten, or something to be feared. He says, it's a wonderful thing to fall asleep and wake up in heaven. He says, and yes, I know this. I know that because of sin, you are going to grieve. Okay? Guess what? Let us grieve. Let us grieve. And let that grief last for more than a few weeks or a few months. Let that grief last for a lifetime. But also, can we grieve with hope? You see the difference that God is saying here? He's saying that we can grieve like the rest of the people who have no hope, and for them, it's terrible. Okay? As a pastor, I get to talk to funeral directors, obviously, because I get to talk to them about 20 times a year. And they always tell me that they can tell before the funeral begins whether the person who died was a Christian or not. Because the grief for the unbeliever is terrible. Because there's no hope. The person who died has died. They're gone. They're dead. And there's no other hope beyond this life. And then they see the Christian funeral with tears, yes, laughter, smiles. Because there's hope. That's the passage that I bring out on the paper that is really important, because you see what I want to do and what we've done at our church is we have a grief support system. We have people who are going to go out and help people who are grieving. As a pastor, I call them periodically. The members of my grief support system will call them. We have meetings at our church where we just get to talk about the grief. Now, it's rather new in our church, but it's something that is growing pretty rapidly, and I think it's going to become great. Because again, in our meetings, we talk about the person who's gone. You know, we talk about that person like he's still here. Because in your heart and mind and soul, they are. And when you allow people to talk about it, it's a healing process, but not something that we're going to say, okay, you're over it, get over it, you're done grieving. No, we allow the people to grieve for the rest of their lives, because they will. We allow them to know that Jesus loved their loved one, died for them, and their loved one is in heaven. We give them hope and peace and joy. And yes, one of the things I'm going to ask them about is how they're doing, but also, are you thinking about the person who died and the joy they have, or are you only thinking about yourself? And it's kind of funny when they start thinking about the one who died and their joy, there's a smile. There always will be. There will be tears as they think about themselves, and now think of the push me, pull me that we have. You know, when our sinful nature rises up, or when our love is there and we want to remember them, we're sad for ourselves, then we think about their joy and we smile. And guess what? It might be minute by minute, it changes hour by hour, day by day, but it's wonderful. It's okay then to say this to the person who's grieving. It's okay. How you grieve is entirely up to you. But grieve with hope. Grieve with the knowledge of the reunion that's going to happen. This is something that I like to give my members too. It's a wonderful little picture. I always say that when you die, you stand before the gates of heaven and the pearly gates open, and those standing right on the other side of the pearly gate are all the people that have gone before you to welcome you in, to celebrate with you. And then about the time the celebration starts to wane a little bit, you turn around and welcome all the people you left behind. This is the hope that we have as Christians. And that's why when we talk to the unbelieving world, they'll never comprehend what we even have until we talk to them about Jesus Christ. Until we tell them, we go behind the bushes and say, it's okay. God's not angry anymore. Jesus died for you. He loves you. And again, that's what we do at our services. We celebrate life. And that's why, again, I've had people say, well, isn't that bad that you can celebrate at a funeral? And I go, you haven't seen my funerals. Because we talk about death, but we talk about death in a positive way. We talk about this gift. Imagine our God who's loving, so loving, that he does not want us to spend eternity in this sinful world. I'd like to ask that question, why did God prevent Adam and Eve from going to the tree of life to the point where he put an angel with a flaming sword to keep them out of the Garden of Eden? Why did he do that? Because he loved them. He didn't want them to spend the rest of eternity in sin. He wanted them at that time to go through the process of coming to him. And he knew that the only way that they were going to come to him was eventually they're going to have to die. So why would God prevent the angel from getting them to for allowing them to get to the tree of life? Because God says death is no longer, because of Jesus Christ, a judgment of sin. It's not a terrible, rotten thing. It is something that God is going to use to bring you to him. And so that's why, again, when we say, how do we view death? Is it this terrible, rotten thing, something to be feared and something to be worried about, something, that we want to teach our children that it's terrible? Or do we want to teach everyone how beautiful it is when a soul, whom Jesus died for, so that they could be in heaven, when that soul enters heaven? It is a celebration. I thought at this point I wanted to open it up for questions.
What do you do if you go to a funeral for somebody that's an unbeliever, and what would you say to their loved one about their loved one that they're not going to heaven?
Okay. So the question is, what do you do when you go to a funeral and you're pretty sure that the person who died is an unbeliever? Okay? First of all, it's not your job to figure out if he's an unbeliever or not. Too many mistakes are made by sinful human beings with good intentions who think that the person who died, because they didn't see him in church for a while, are an unbeliever. Okay? Please don't make that judgment call. That's the first thing. Second of all, then what are you going to tell them about Jesus Christ? See, the person who is mourning, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are wearied and burdened, and I will give you rest. What I do in a situation like that is simply to direct them to Jesus Christ. At that point in time, we may not talk about the person who died. If I'm not sure that they're in heaven, what I'm going to be doing is talking to the person about grief. And that I'm here to help and support, that I love them and so does God. That's as far as you need to go. Okay? But I would be there for them. See? Because they might have that question, is this loved one in heaven? And then that's a time to send them to a pastor. Okay? I always say send them to a pastor at that point so that they can talk to them. Because again, I've had so many people come to me and say, Pastor, how can you tell us that that person is going to be in heaven because we're not sure? And I say, but Jesus gives us the benefit of doubt. It's not depending upon what I do or say or think. It's dependent upon Him. So that's why, again, we direct them to. But don't shun them. You know, the person who died might be an unbeliever, might be in hell. What do you do to their parents? You know what the reaction of a lot of people is? Never mention that person again. And it's terrible. Okay? Embrace them, hug them, be there for them, and teach them about Jesus Christ. Okay? Any other questions? Because you see, this is where one of my pet peeves as a pastor is right now. What do we do with a grieving family after the funeral? What do we do with someone who's grieving? Do we call them? Do we stop by? Do we send them a note saying, I'm thinking about you? And how long do we do that? See, here's the problem. We do that for about the first 2 weeks. And then after that, we think, the grief must be over. Let's go on with life. The grief will never go over. Get over, I should say. The grief will always be there. So, be a part of them, help them. And you know what? When they start to grieve, tell them it's okay. Tell them it's all right. And just be there. There's one little quote I have in here, and I did not read the whole paper, so please bear with me. I think what we were talking about. Let me see if I can find it real quick. It is a quote by someone who was talking about grief. Let me find it now. It's by a Dennis Hulk, who wrote a book that says, don't sing songs to someone who's grieving. And he made the comment, and I just can't seem to find it right now, but that's all right. He made a comment that says, for someone who is going to a grieving person, the words that you say to a grieving person in love, the embrace that you do to a person in love, the hand that you hold of a person grieving in love, it's not you doing this. It's God doing that. We are the source of love to every person that's grieving. But the ultimate source of that love is not the Christian. The ultimate source is God. In 1 John chapter 4, God says, I am love. So when you love with God's love, it's not you loving. It's God loving through you. And this is part of our life as Christians, that God has said, all I need is a voice. All I need is hands. All I need is arms. Let me hug them through you. Let me speak to them through you. Let me hold their hand through you. And as Christians, if we could ever comprehend that aspect of God, we would be much more compassionate, much more loving, and much more certain to help people. Because oftentimes I have people who say, I don't know if I can go to a grieving person's home because I don't know what to say. So what do you say? I would say your presence is all that's needed. I went to one lady's house, and I think we were there. I think I was there for half an hour before a word was said. Because for that full half hour, all she could do is weep. And so I just stood there until she finished, and then we talked. And she told me about a few months afterwards that that silence had greater therapeutic value than any words that I could say. And that's why it's not important what you say. It is more important what you do. You see what I'm saying? And if you're worried about what to say, then before you walk into that house, say, Lord, give me the words. And don't be surprised that if you say that prayer, He will. Because I can tell you story after story of being someplace where I had no idea what to say. And words were coming out of my mouth, and I'm going, while I'm saying the words, I'm thinking, you know, that's a pretty good statement. I never thought of that. I was learning from the words coming from my mouth because they didn't belong to me. They belonged to somebody else. And that's why as Christians, when we think about this topic called death, because we're afraid of it, sometimes we don't know what to do. But just do something. Okay? Yes?
I think it's important to me as a Christian to have input into my funeral service so that when the church is filled or not filled with people, that what is sung and what is said and what is read, the focus is on who my Savior is and my confidence in that hope. That there's just my witness, I will witness in death.
At our church, we have a form that can be filled out with, on that form is hymns, Bible verses, readings. I even asked them to pick out my sermon text. When I have time, like in a case of a cancer patient or this lady that was 101, where I have the time to speak with them while they're in that process, we actually sit down and put my service together. And it was really kind of interesting. I did one service about 4 weeks ago that this person couldn't sing very well. Yet for the funeral service, he chose 8 hymns. And we sang every one of them. And we sang all the verses. You see how that goes? Because he told me, he says, if you don't sing all the verses, I'm getting out of that casket. Okay? So when I told the widow that, she said, sounds like him. But again, yes, when do we have time? Now, when we're taken away unexpectedly, sudden heart attacks and things like that. But again, I always tell people that when you are well, what would you want your survivors to hear? What would you want me to say? And I always like to do that. Like I said, I have in my church forms that everybody fills out. And a church of 1,600 people, we need those forms. Okay? Because I can't talk to everybody individually. Okay? But the point is that think about, what do you want to say? What witness do you want to give to your family when you're in the casket? And what is the pastor going to say? Okay? And that's why I also, before I do that, when I know that I'm going to be conducting a funeral in about 3 weeks, the person and I are going to sit down, we're going to talk. And what's important? Where is Jesus? How much do you love your family? What do you want them to do, and where do you want them to go for comfort and peace? And it becomes a wonderful way for the person to speak from the casket. And I always love that one. Because then that service becomes so meaningful to the immediate family. And again, this is what we do. Okay? How much time do we have left?
Maybe 2 minutes.
2 minutes? Means I have another couple of questions if you have any. But I want you to think about that. Yes, all the way in the back.
How do you mentioned before when someone loses someone that you just let them grieve and they'll be in a constant state of grieving. What about, how do you handle that situation when during that grieving process they get angry with God for they're punishing, God's punishing them for taking away this person?
Okay, good question. Can a person who's grieving get angry with God? And I would say yes. He's a big guy. Okay? As long as the anger lasts a moment. Because when I'm with someone and they're angry, we'll let them vent. And then we'll talk to them. Because then they don't understand what death is. And then that's, to me, is a teaching moment. In the ministry that I conduct, I look for teaching moments. When somebody is really angry at God, that's a teaching moment. Because if they're angry at God, they're not thinking of the person who left. They're only thinking about themselves. And this is where we want to help them overcome that. Okay? Now, please understand that even as a pastor, there comes a point in time in which if the grieving process is out of control, now they need counseling. Okay? And that's where, again, if it's just a momentary thing where they start crying or something, that's no big deal. But if the crying a year later is going on for days and days and days, counseling is needed. Okay? So that's why. But again, the anger. It's okay for a point. Okay? Sometimes we get angry at God, and God understands. I often had somebody ask me one time in a Bible class, is it all right to get angry with God? I went, of course. As long as we come back and understand how much He loves us. Because usually if you're angry with God, you have lost track of how much He loves you. And then that means we got to go back and review that. Okay? But that's a good question. It's okay. See, it's okay. Any other questions? Yes?
For the person who's in the last hours, dying hours, to days or weeks, the loved ones are often sitting with that person. The person may not be conscious or able to really communicate what is the most important thing that person needs to hear from the loved ones during that time that's spent with them. I think I know the answer, but I think...
Well, there's two things that you have to tell the person who's on their deathbed. The one thing, obviously, is you need to say, I love you. Okay? That has to be just something said. But the second thing that I always tell people after Jesus Christ, because I mean, obviously, we're going to be talking about Him, is to tell them it's okay to go. Sometimes people think that dying is, they're racked with guilt because they're leaving people behind. And then when you tell them that God's going to take care of me, it's all right, and I'll see you soon, quite often that fills them with the hope. It's kind of interesting. I've had so many people that were in comas that hung on and hung on and hung on and hung on. And finally I went to the family and said, would you tell that person it's okay to go? And they went up to the bedside and they said, it's okay to go. And 5 minutes later they went. Because again, it's all God. The medical profession doesn't know. If you ask a doctor, really, do you know what takes place at death? They can tell you physically, but they don't know the cause. They can tell you the heart stops beating, but they can't tell you why. We know why. So, yes?
I would agree with you on that. I'm just thinking of the hours and weeks before that point comes. Whether or not that person wouldn't like just to have the loved one or loved ones read scripture, read the gospel. Don't talk about the Packers or weather or stuff like that. But speak about what's most important for reading scripture.
Well, and to me, that's a given. See, if you have a person that's dying, that's something that's continuous through the whole dying process. As a pastor, if I know somebody's under deathbed, we'll be there every day, okay? Telling them, helping them, telling the family what to read. But to me, that's a given. See, that's so much of a part of the dying process, that they need to know Jesus loves them, He's forgiven them, He's going to take them to heaven. That's part of it. And let them know. But in my own father's case, just to let you know what God did for us. Because there's 5 kids, and my father was one of those staunch Germans that would never let anyone tell him how much they loved him. So God gave my father a stroke, and he couldn't talk back. So each of us kids took a day. Each of us had one day with my dad where he couldn't talk back now, and everybody could tell him what they really thought about him. And I think that's really important, that on a deathbed, you remind that person, tell them. And it's amazing to see what medical people tell us. Be careful what you say to a person in a coma, because they will remember it when you get up to heaven. Because the last sense to go is the sense of hearing. Okay? So even somebody that's dying and is a coma, you think, oh, I can't talk to them. Please do that. Okay? Thank you very much.